Hello dear friends of Inside Opera and Classical Music, and welcome to a new video. Have you ever heard of the Schubertiade? Nowadays they are events and concerts dedicated to the figure of the great Austrian composer Franz Peter Schubert. These are real music festivals with numerous concerts of all kinds, Liederabend, piano recitals, orchestral concerts, and sometimes even masterclasses to allow young musicians to perfect themselves in the repertoire of the famous composer. However, what may seem like a simple name to call a festival dedicated to a composer, well, you will be surprised at its origins. But before, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. What are you waiting for? It's free, so you help the channel grow and make it known more and more to music lovers. When we talk about Franz Schubert, there are those who, like me, immediately think of lieder music, others think of piano music, others of orchestral music. And yet, for many and many years, until the mid-1900s, the first thing associated with this wonderful composer was dance music and pleasant melodies. Absolutely reductive, and today we know it, but this wrong fame also derives from this Schubertiaden. In fact, Schubert wrote many pieces that we can define as occasional, to brighten up meetings with friends or dancing evenings. He was well acquainted with the musical fashion in Wien and managed to create a remarkable musical production that, despite being very fashionable for the time, also reflected in part his intimacy and his desire to get away from everyday life by creating escapist music. We are talking about music no longer linked to poetry, but about music that draws its inspiration from tradition, whether it be a cultured or popular tradition. I remember that Schubert was an independent musician in Wien. He was not employed by noble families or rich bishops, and so the opportunities for a well-paid job were rather scarce. He had wealthy friends who sometimes supported him, but they certainly weren't patrons, so he lived without economic tranquility. Schubert, however, had many friends, and many were musicians, artists, opera addicts, members of the small nobility, and, above all, lovers of good music. This led to convivial meetings, encounters between friends where they danced, sang, drank, and ate sausages, meetings aimed not only at having fun, but also born to support the young musician who performed on the piano throughout the evening. They were called the Wusterbälle, the sausage prom. The theme of the evenings? Schubert's music, and with the success of these evenings, from Wusterbälle, Schubertiaden were born. These meetings were organized from 1815, first in the large apartment in Wien of the jurist Ignaz von Sonnleithner, but then other friends also offered their residence for the proms, including Franz von Schober, Eduard von Bauernfeld, and Josef Freier von Spaun. And is right at the home of the latter that the first meeting officially called Schubertiade took place in 1821. Josef Freier von Spaun recalled these meetings as follows: "Through Schubert we all became brothers and friends." And they were in effect meetings in friends' homes, which slowly tended to become fashionable meetings, sometimes even a little libertine and certainly a little eccentric, meetings where Schubert's music was always the protagonist. And I'm talking about Schubert's music and not Schubert himself, because these parties began to become more and more numerous and demanding, and sometimes Schubert himself didn't have all this desire to participate, sometimes even for health problems. And this is told by his friend Eduard von Bauernfeld. It was not uncommon for a company of guests to wait him in vain, while with some schoolmates, his former colleagues, he was peacefully drinking wine in an out-of-the-way tavern. If we scolded him the next day, he would reply with a good-natured smile, "I wasn't in the mood." If we had been present at one of these parties, we could have heard him play for hours, all the new pieces composed, and if there weren't any, friends would have encouraged him to improvise something. And Schubert played until he was exhausted. And he also often sang, and it seems that he did it well, with what his friends called voix de compositeur, composer's voice, a voice not really set on an opera model, but it seems it was very beautiful, between the light tenor and the baritone, and Schubert always sang with great taste and a lot of passion. These Schubertiaden grew more and more, and from simple musical evenings they began to include picnics on the meadows, walks in the woods, readings by great poets. In short, it was accompanied by the best art and the entertainment possible, and they always had inevitably ended with music by Schubert. Sometimes these encounters reached real artistic peaks, also thanks to the presence of the famous baritone Johann Michael Vogl, who sang with pleasure also with Schubert, and later also the baritenor Karl von Schönstein. The simple dances were combined with more cultured music and the performance of some Lieder. To make you imagine the greatness of these meetings, the few friends with whom it all began soon reached over 100 guests, with more and more important guests. These very successful convivial encounters thus ended up creating the fame of the composer of Walzer, who loves wine. But in reality, Schubert had the great merit of ennobling the popular and traditional melody, also creating with poor and simple starting material true masterpieces of classical music. All this deviated from his higher musical production, the one that reflects the composer's inwardness and sense of loneliness and melancholy. Schubert himself said, "No one here has passion for true art. I'm alone with my loved ones, whose image I keep in my room, in my piano, and in my soul." And perhaps this widening of the Schubertiaden, if on the one hand it helped him financially, on the other hand it did not give him much pleasure. Our company, by dint of increasing the chorus with rough people, has procured a death from excess of sausages and beer. Unfortunately, Schubert died very young, at only 31 years old, and as sometimes happens with the death of the composer, his compositions began to become more and more famous, and it was the same for the Schubertiaden, at least in the early period. His friends did not continue this tradition for long, and these meetings became a real tribute to their deceased friend and to his music. But after reaching a peak, they went out of fashion. The years passed, and slowly the meetings became more and more sparse, but an association of friends of Franz Schubert was created that continued to repropose the Schubertiaden in the recurrences of the composer's birth and death. Since 1976, Schubertiaden has been held regularly in Hohenems and Schwarzenberg in Austria, and is probably the largest Schubert festival, with around 80 events and 35,000 visitors each year. But the Schubertiaden can also be found in other cities, not only in Austria and Germany, from Luxembourg to Switzerland and Spain, but which have become in effect festivals dedicated to the composer, with concerts, conferences and masterclasses. No more meetings of friends, so From a certain point of view, it is wonderful that there are these festivals to remember this wonderful composer. On the other hand, they have lost their original form, their side of conviviality. And now you try to imagine those wonderful parties with dances, poetry, and good music in the splendid Wien Biedermeier, a golden world of Schubert's music, and confess, if it were possible to peek into time, wouldn't you like to spend an evening there? Thank you for watching this video. I remind you to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and we meet again soon with a new video.